I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars. Today we get our first drive of the new Polestar 4. This is the car that Polestar says is really starting their next chapter. Well, this and the larger Polestar 3, the company is naming their vehicles in order of succession that they come out in rather than their size within the range. So once you get your head around that, it sort of makes sense that the Polestar 4 is now the vehicle that this brand is going to use to tackle threats like the new fully electric Porsche Macan. Now, we know that Porsche doesn't mess around when it comes to making their EVs fun to drive, high quality, and they just feel like a luxury car. So if Polestar wants to shoot for the likes of Porsche, then this thing needs to be good. The brand says that it's a coupe SUV. Its format is unusual. It's a little bit sedan, a little bit crossover, a little bit SUV. I'll let you make up your own mind about that. What I'll say is that aesthetically, I think it's a pretty attractive car, although there is one feature around back which is going to severely polarize opinion, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, in today's video, we're going to check out the interior of this car, the back seat, the boot. We'll discuss some of the running costs and the efficiency, or perhaps lack thereof, on this dual motor all-wheel drive version, and then we'll take it out for a drive on some great roads to start getting an impression of what this vehicle is going to be like, and whether you should order one. Before we get started, hit subscribe down below. And now let's get started. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. Jumping into the Polestar 4 now, the first thing you're going to realize is that this vehicle has a really lovely cabin. The materials that have been used feel premium and luxurious, the layout makes sense, and unlike some other EVs, there are still physical controls for a bunch of the functions, including your gear selection. We've got a little column shifter over here. You've still got your indicators, you've got your wipers. I personally don't mind the fact that in the Tesla Model 3, they're now on the steering wheel, but I think a lot more people are going to prefer these traditional controls. Now, if you already have a Polestar 2 and you're thinking about upgrading to a Polestar 4, you are going to notice that this interior takes a big step up in both perceived expense and actual quality. In many ways, the Polestar 2 feels like perhaps a slightly cheaper version of a Volvo XC40. Well, now Polestar has decided they want to go the other way. They want to be an Audi or a Porsche competitor, not a Volvo or a Tesla rival. And so we're starting to see the influence of that decision now in the cabin of the Polestar 4. Firstly, it looks like a luxury car. The tech is really pretty. This screen over here obviously stands proud of the dash, but it does look like a high-end iPad with a lovely metallic surround, and it's bright, crisp, customizable, and the software actually works really well. This is Polestar's new Android-based software stack. It's an improvement on the old Android-based software stack. It is snappy. It's still got Apple CarPlay, which is nice if you want to use that, but the integrated features are pretty well executed. And then this screen in front of the driver, love the look of it. Again, crisp, presents the information that you need. You can put a map on it, you can look at your range, speed, all the rest of it. It just works. Now, moving on to the interior choices, this car actually has what I think is the coolest interior. So it's actually got a recycled knit on the seat. So it is a textile, like a cloth seat, but it feels good, looks good, 100% recycled, and it matches well to this textural trim over here on the doors and on the dash. For an extra $7,000 though, you can actually have Napa leather in either charcoal or in zinc, which is this light color. But unfortunately, if you're going to want your Polestar 4 beneath the luxury car tax in Australia, you can only get black vinyl. So all these fancy looking ones that you're going to see in this video, they blow way beyond the luxury car tax, which would mean that they're not eligible for federal incentives in Australia. But again, if Polestar thinks they want to be a Porsche rival, then I guess they're not going to be chasing those incentives. You can let me know what you think about that down below in the comments. The seats themselves, comfortable, ergonomic, supportive. There's plenty of storage space. This massive floating sort of wing in the center here has more storage beneath it. You've got a box here in the center. You've got fast charging USB-C ports, up to 60 watts in this car, which is great. If I was to find a couple of faults, there'd really be two main ones. The first is that the glass roof is standard and you've got to pay $2,700 to make it electrochromatic, which will darken it. You can pay $300 and get a bit of a cheap looking dinky cover to put on your glass roof. Frankly, I just wish it was either optional or smaller, because here in Spain, we're kind of baking in the cars today, yet again for Polestar, sort of flashbacks to my Polestar 2 long-termer. And the second would be that I really don't think they needed to make the direction of the air vents electronic through the screen. So much quicker and easier just to manipulate that briefly by yourself. So that is a little bit of an example of tech going too far. All in all though, I gotta say I like the cabin. Let's check out the back seat now. Now, moving to the back, the first impression that you get is really one of space. There are a few EVs like this, typically the ones with 3-meter long wheelbases, which is basically what we've got here in the Polestar 4. Even though the car as a whole is not massive, it's about 4.8 meters long, so it will fit in a lot of garages. The rear seat legroom is just exceptional. The driver's seat is where I sit at 6 foot tall or 183 centimeters. I've got vast legroom. I've got a little bit of toe room, even with the seat on its lowest setting. And one thing Polestar has improved, if not perfected, compared to the Polestar 2, is that there's actually a little bit of under thigh angle here in the back to support your legs. You still have to splay them a bit, but it's a lot better than some other EVs that I've tested. I still think it could be a touch better again, however. Headroom is fine. Again, we've got this standard glass roof, which is a blessing and a curse, but one thing it does is it does liberate a bit more headroom for taller people. All the plush, textural, beautiful materials continue to the back as well. And you can get this digital screen down here, which controls things like the rear heated seats and your infotainment. If you've got little brats, they might sit here and change your audio controls, so that might need to be turned off if you're a parent. Again, some fast charging USB-C ports, air vents, and this beautiful texture on the headliner too really does sort of start to create the impression that this is a luxury car. Plus, we've got a little pull tab here that brings down this center seat, and you've got controls for power reclining rear seats. So again, starting to see a few functions here which elevate the Polestar 4 above and beyond something like a Tesla Model Y, BMW i4, vehicles like that, which probably sit, I don't know, maybe half a class beneath this vehicle in terms of where it's trying to be positioned. Overall, the space on offer and the quality inside is pretty impressive. Remember how up front I mentioned severely polarizing? Well, that feature would be this, which is the lack of a rear window. Instead of having a rear window, it's another body-colored panel. That's because the designers of the Polestar 4 decided to emphasize rear headroom over having a rear window. So that has been effective, as we just saw in the back. But what it does mean is that you are completely reliant on your digital rear view mirror to see behind the car. Good thing it actually works relatively well, although not perfectly, as I'll get into when we take this thing for a drive. What I want to talk about though is the boot space. We've got a little button up here just above the body-colored Polestar logo to open up this big old door. Look at the size of the struts, they're massive, so this piece must be very heavy. And it opens up to reveal a good sized boot. I'll pop the size on the screen here. The lift over height is relatively high. Because this vehicle isn't on air, you can't drop it, but you get this nice finisher to protect your paintwork. Nicely carpeted and everything feels high quality. You can open up the boot floor for a bit more space, including a hole for your charging cables. What's really interesting is that as well as having 60/40 split folding rear seats, unfortunately not 40/20/40, we do have this panel here, which you can bring down and you can actually see right through into the cabin. So it's a traditional hatchback, but you can kind of run it as a sedan with the stuff in the boot isolated from the occupants, which is nice. Now we do have a button up here to drop that powered tailgate. Normally at this price, we'd expect to see a button to also lock the car, but Polestar has an answer for that, and that is that the key itself is ultra wideband, so all you have to do is walk away. The car will lock itself like a Tesla. Next up, let's chat about range and efficiency. Now, the Polestar 4 is only going to have one battery at launch. It's 100 kilowatt hours total, 94 kilowatt hours usable. You can choose rear-wheel drive or dual motor all-wheel drive, which basically just duplicates the rear motor at the front. Power is intense. 400 kilowatts if you go for the dual motor, which is what our tester is today. The efficiency claim looks pretty good, just over 16 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers for a range of just under 600 kilometers. Now, I've driven this car for about 130 kilometers so far today on a drive route that was maybe 40% highway, 40% country roads, 20% urban. All pretty fair, and I didn't hammer it too hard. What I found was the efficiency is actually really far from the claim, at least so today. I've got about 24 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks out of this car, which would imply a range of just over 400 kilometers. So if you're going to want to get closer to those impressive, bold claims on paper, and you don't want to be recharging this vehicle too often behind its quite fancy powered charging door, it's a luxury car, I'll have you know, you're going to need to drive a little bit more frugally than I was able to today. Of course, your other option is to go for the rear wheel drive, which I'm personally starting to sense could be the sweet spot. I'll explain more about that when we go for a drive.
But before we go for a drive in the Polestar 4, I need to let you know that Polestar inadvertently put us into China specification cars on this event, which had a different shock absorber, top mount, and software tune for the steering than what we'll get in Australia. As soon as the car lands locally, I'll test it again to see how different and how much better it is for our roads.
Okay, let's take a drive in the Polestar 4. I've come across to Spain, must be nice, for the first drive of this vehicle. And the good thing is that the drive has been quite extensive and quite varied. Sometimes when we get first drives of cars, they're very, very short, and it's kind of hard to draw too many conclusions. But the good news is that I feel like I actually know this car relatively well after a decent day of driving it in a couple of different trims. Now, as you would have seen from the start of this video, I was presenting with a white on white dual motor all-wheel drive, but I've managed to wrangle this car, which is quite different. This is a blue on black single motor rear wheel drive. And as I was alluding to earlier, that maybe the rear wheel drive is the sweet spot, well, a drive in this specification has confirmed that to be the case. But we'll come back to that in just a minute. First of all, let's talk about the choice that you have to make if you buy a Polestar 4. Basically, it's pretty simple. You only get one battery size for now, and you need to choose whether you want rear wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Now, a lot of the early volume, a lot of the early demand will be for the headline vehicle, the dual motor, which has 400 kilowatts of power. That's pretty stout performance. And unsurprisingly, the 0 to 100 time is rather swift, 3.8 seconds in fact. So up until this point, that is Polestar's quickest car from 0 to 100. And the performance of the all-wheel drive is just devastatingly fast. If your idea of fun in driving an electric car is accelerating very rapidly away from a standstill or very fast out of corners with heaps of grip and heaps of traction, then the Polestar 4 dual motor will be right up your alley. Its cross-country pace is really astonishingly fast, but it's mainly because it just hammers from corner to corner. The problem is what happens within the corner itself, which is what has sort of made my feelings a little bit reserved when it comes to the dual motor version of this car. Now, if you go for the single motor rear wheel drive Polestar 4, all that happens is it drops the front motor. So instead of having that 400 kilowatt figure, instead we have 200 kilowatts of power and 343 newton meters of torque. What does that do to the performance? Well, let's accelerate promptly here. It dulls it. What a shock. But it still is a smartly accelerative vehicle. It's not exactly a slow car. The official claim is 7.1 seconds from 0 to 100, and that's partially because the weight is still pretty high. Polestar has not yet cracked making a light vehicle. The Polestar 2 is a lot heavier than the Tesla Model 3. The Polestar 4 is considerably heavier than something like a entry-level BMW i4, for instance, and you can feel that extra mass. And it does blunt the 0 to 100 time of the rear-wheel drive model quite a bit, but not to the extent that I wouldn't want to own this one instead. The performance is measured, you've got enough pace to overtake on back roads or to accelerate away relatively promptly from a standstill, but it's what it does to the chassis which is most important. There are other choices to be made, in particular whether or not you want the really quite expensive performance package which gives you Brembo brakes and Polestar engineered chassis tuning. Frankly, you actually shouldn't want that stuff. Why? Because for all of Polestar's talk about this being a pure progressive performance sports oriented SUV, it's actually not that sporty. The Polestar 4 is much better at grand touring than it is at pretending to be a sports car. First of all, it's too heavy. We could say that about lots of EVs, from the Porsche Macan to the Hyundai Ioniq 5N, but those cars still end up being quite fun and sporty to drive. The Polestar 4 hasn't managed the same feat, at least not in dual motor all-wheel drive format with the performance package. That's not this car at its best. Instead, what I would do is actually take one a little bit more modestly specified. So this one, the single motor rear wheel drive, is where I would start. And this particular car is actually quite well done because A, it doesn't have the performance package. You can't get that if you choose rear wheel drive for some reason, even though, you know, traditional drivers would probably prefer the rear wheel drive layout. But it's what it does to the chassis that really counts. There are some other choices to be made, in particular whether you want the performance package. If you go for the all-wheel drive, it gives you even bigger wheels, which firms up the ride even further, Brembo brakes, which undoubtedly will deliver better stopping distances, and Polestar engineered chassis tuning. Now, I just don't think you need that stuff. The reason being because the Polestar 4 is not actually very sporty. It's much better at flowing, gradual grand touring than it is, you know, trying to attack a series of hairpins, particularly the all-wheel drive model, where it just doesn't feel super happy in that context. So if I was to buy a Polestar 4, which I would consider because the quality is so good and it's so attractive to look at, I would go for a more modest specification. Firstly, I'd start with the single motor rear wheel drive, which is initially going to save you about 10 grand. Even in base form, it's reasonably well equipped, but you're going to want to go for the Plus pack and get the Harman Kardon audio and the better headlights, and you'll want to do the Pro pack as well, which gives you actually quite attractive, elegant looking 21-inch wheels, which are fitted to this car, so a step down from the 22s, good compromise, and it also gives you that knit interior, which I think is a really nice way to liven up the interior. It's a nicer material, it's lighter, but you don't have to spend massive on the Napa leather upgrade. The main benefit you're going to get by going for the sort of spec I just described is a more balanced and happy chassis. It's actually a more rewarding and more fun vehicle to drive that feels much more in its comfort zone. The main issue with the dual motor all-wheel drive is what it does to the steering, and it's a similar issue to what I found on my long-term Polestar 2 dual motor all-wheel drive with performance package, which ultimately feels relatively similar to drive to this car. By putting a massive motor on the front axle and basically squaring up the power delivery, you get quite a bit of understeer when you're accelerating out of a turn in the dual motor all-wheel drive. Instead of feeling rear biased like a Taycan or an Ioniq 5 or a BMW i4, instead it's totally foursquare, it's totally neutral, and it actually robs fun and driver engagement from the process, which is a real shame because you can tell the underlying chassis of this vehicle is really quite solid and stiff and well sorted. But the second you step back to the single motor rear wheel drive, it immediately frees up the steering to do what it's supposed to do, turn the car. You're not feeling that understeery effect, which you're lumped with by putting a huge 200 kilowatt motor on the front axle. Instead, the rear end does the pushing, which is the classic layout for any sort of driver's car. The front end does the steering. The steering feel gets better. The traction out of corners in some ways gets better because you don't have this scrabbly front end trying to pull you out while the rear is also pushing as hard as it can. Everything feels lighter, and it is lighter by about 150 kilos or something. It feels lighter, it feels more agile, and it just feels more relaxed. The single motor rear wheel drive is the way the Polestar 4 was meant to be. Okay, fine, it's not devastatingly fast, it just has enough performance. But once you're up to speed, my God, it pays dividends to keep this car a little bit more simple. I still suspect that the Porsche Macan electric is going to be more fun to drive. Porsche have really nailed chassis development for EVs. But this car is fun to drive in a way which is a little more restrained, a little bit more satisfying. It's in the way that, you know, a Volvo XC90 is satisfying to drive. It just gets the job done well with nice damping, sorted and pleasant handling, decent steering and decent performance. Well, the Polestar 4 is not a hyper-athletic sports SUV, and that's completely fine. I'm just not entirely convinced that Polestar themselves have gotten to that realization. Other aspects, it's pretty refined. It's quiet, there's a little bit of wind whistle around the mirrors at highway speed, but nothing serious. The safety systems are reasonably well tuned. You do feel the lane keep nipping at you from time to time, and you'll want to deactivate the speed warning because it just beeps at you incessantly if you go 1k an hour over the speed limit, even if it hasn't read the speed limit correctly. But that's easy to do. It's one touch on the steering wheel. Love to see that sort of thinking. So all in all, the Polestar 4 is a satisfying, good, easy EV to drive. But keep the spec simple and you'll actually have a much better experience. So those are my detailed first impressions of the new Polestar 4. Now this one is a dual motor all-wheel drive with all the fruit, so a very expensive test car, and it's worth reflecting that you can get one for much cheaper than this. But Polestar are the ones telling us that the Porsche Macan Electric is the chief rival to this vehicle. So even at these higher price points, it needs to be very good. And in some ways it is. I think aesthetically the Polestar 4 is appealing, at least to me. The interior is lovely with exceptional materials and well-integrated technology and comfortable seats. The packaging is pretty good. But on the driving front, I really have a sense that the rear-wheel drive models could be the sweet spot. They're not really lacking for power, And the all-wheel drive is devastatingly rapid, but that's kind of its only party trick. It's just not that much fun. It is so competent and so quick that I feel like it sort of bleeds away some of that driver engagement, which is what I'm looking for in a vehicle like this, and what the Macan Electric is slated to provide. So I'm very keen to drive the single motor version of the Polestar 4 to see whether not only will you save money, but you might also gain something in the process. Keen to know your opinion, so please let me know down below this video in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell for more content just like this. And thanks for watching Chasing Cars.